The first letter came 43 days after she buried him, folded neatly on her porch rail. No footprints in the snow, no carriage tracks, just there it was his handwriting, her husband's. John Whitlow, dead, buried, grave marked with her own hands. That morning, Margaret hadn't cried. She had just stared at it, lips sealed, heart pounding. 'Cause it wasn't possible, and yet it knew things no one could have known, not even John, ... unless he was somehow still watching. Tonight made 5. The prairie wind had gone still like it. 2 was waiting. Margaret sat on her creaking rocking chair, the cabin's old wood groaning around her. In her lap, another letter. Worn edges. Same cursive. Same cedar scent she'd buried 3 years ago in a folded uniform and sealed pine box. She hadn't opened this one yet. Not since the 3rd letter, the one that nearly broke her. That one had told her something that hadn't happened. Yet, but it did. Exactly as the letter warned. Now she feared what the 5th one would say, because each letter felt less like a message and more like a warning. She stared at the fire. It was dying. For some reason that felt symbolic. She whispered, almost afraid to hear herself, John. What are you trying to tell me? She peeled the seal open with trembling fingers. Only 6 lines. Margaret, I lied to you while I lived. The truth was never in my words, but in my silence. Before this week ends, go to the tree behind the church. Dig. There's something there I never told you about. And one final line, written more shakily than the rest. If you don't, someone else will. 8. Suddenly, a creak outside the window. Margaret stiffened. Shh. She turned her head slowly. Toward the dark pane of glass. A shadow moved past the porch. No footsteps. Just the sound of the wind, picking back up. Like it had been holding its breath until now. She held the letter tighter. She wasn't sure if it was the dead she feared, or the living. The next morning, Margaret woke before the sun. The letter hadn't left her mind, not for a second. She hadn't slept much. How could she? When her dead husband's voice had returned asking her to dig up secrets she didn't know she'd buried. She wrapped her shawl tighter and lit the lantern. The house creaked the way old wood does when it remembers something. She packed a small satchel, gloves, a spade, a flask of water, and the letter folded tight and pressed to her chest like a prayer. The church sat a half-mile from her cabin, at an old wooden frame, faded white paint, and a small crooked cross. Tilting from the steeple, behind it a patch of dry land with weeds taller than memory, and in the middle, the tree. It wasn't much. Twisted, low, and blackened from a lightning strike 10 years ago. Locals said it had never grown right after. That, some whispered it was cursed. She never believed that, till now. She looked around. No one. The town barely had 16 souls left, and none of them wandered this early. She walked to the base of the tree and knelt. The earth was dry but not hard, like it wanted to give something up. Her spade hit something after only a few minutes. Not wood, but something softer. Wrapped in oilcloth, she pulled it up with both hands. A small rectangular bundle, not heavy. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a journal, leather-bound. Water-stained and familiar. John's journal, she remembered. It from the war years. He used to write at night when the world was asleep, said it helped him quiet the guns in his head. But he'd told her it burned in the barn fire that took their horses and nearly the house too. He'd cried when he told her. She had cried with him. But now, here it was. Not ash, not ruined. Hidden, her hands trembled as she opened the first page that the ink had faded, but she could still make it out. If someone finds this, and that someone is Margaret, then I'm sorry. Should have told you long ago. About the man in the cellar. About what happened that night in Hollow Creek. And about the boy. She stopped reading. The boy? What boy? She scanned the page again, heart racing. But before she could turn it, the wind behind her shifted heavy. Close. She stood fast. Clutching the journal, someone was watching. She turned toward the church, nothing. But when she turned back to the tree, a shadow moved just beyond the weeds. She froze. Who's there? She called out, her voice steadier than she felt. No answer. just the soft crunch of boots. Walking away, she didn't chase. Not yet. She had something in her hands, more dangerous than any man. A dead man's secrets and maybe, dead child's name. Margaret didn't return home right away. She couldn't, not with that journal in her satchel. Not with the memory of those footsteps in the weeds still echoing in her ears. She sat inside the church instead, where morning light fell like broken glass through cracked, stained windows. The pews creaked under her as she flipped open the second page. Hollow Creek, May 14th, 1872. Margaret, I hope you never read this, but if you are, then I have failed to keep my promise. Her breath caught. She knew that date. It was the same week John came home from the war, thinner, quieter, changed. She had chalked it up to battle trauma. But maybe it wasn't just war he brought home. The entry continued. There was a boy. His name was Eli. He wasn't mine by blood, but I swore to protect him like he was. I failed. I left him behind that night. They came for me, but took him instead. He screamed for me. I ran, Maggie. And I never told you because how could you? Love a man who left a child to die? Margaret sat still as stone. Her husband, the same man who rocked their niece to sleep, who once cried over a broken sparrow's wing, he had left a child behind. And worse, he had buried the truth. She flipped to the next page, but it was stuck. Some old spill had fused it shut. Carefully, she worked it loose. Another entry? Short, he's back. I saw him in town. Same eyes. He didn't die. But he looked right through me, like he was waiting for something. Margaret's fingers tingled. If that boy Eli was still alive, could he be the one leaving the letters? She thought back to the figure in the weeds, the way it hadn't spoken. Only watched, she suddenly felt exposed. Small. Hunted. Maybe she left the church quietly and returned home just as the wind began to pick up dust across the prairie. Inside, she locked the door, something she hadn't done in years. She set the journal on the table beside the candle. Noticed something new. A second envelope, placed neatly where she would see it. Right beside the wood stove. She hadn't heard anyone. Hadn't seen anyone, just like the others. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was just one line, written in a darker ink. The boy you forgot remembers everything. She dropped the letter. The wind rattled the window frame, but it wasn't the wind she was afraid of now. It was the knock. 3 slow taps on her door, then silence. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Her hand still gripped the letter that said, "The boy you forgot remembers everything." And now a knock. Not loud, not angry, but deliberate. Too deliberate. Margaret stared at the doorknob, like it might turn itself. She waited, but the knock didn't come again. Just silence. She reached for the rifle. Under the kitchen bench, the last time she'd used it was to scare off coyotes. She wasn't sure it would still fire. But tonight, it wasn't the coyotes she feared. It was the past. She opened the door slowly. The porch was empty. No footprints in the dust. No man walking away. It's just the night. Wide and waiting. Then she saw it, another envelope. Placed carefully on the second step. She picked it up. This one wasn't sealed, just folded. Inside was a single line. You looked right at me. I was there, Hollow Creek, under the barn. She stepped back. That place again. It's Hollow Creek. She had never been there, but John, he had. He'd gone for trade, for supplies, once every few months. He never spoke of it much. But once. Years ago, he came back with blood on his collar. Said it was a hunting accident. She had believed him, because back then, love meant trust. Now she wasn't so sure what love meant at all. She stayed up the rest of the night, reading more of the journal. In one entry John had written, "There were voices under that barn. I swear it. I think they kept him there. I heard him, Eli, but I couldn't move. I was already running." Margaret closed the journal and whispered into the quiet, "What did they do to that boy?" The lamp beside her flickered, and for the first time since this all began, she felt. Watched from inside the house, she turned sharply. Nothing but the air felt wrong. like someone had exhaled a secret. The next morning, she made a decision. If there was truth buried in Hollow Creek, she'd find it. She packed a bag, saddle-strapped the spade again, and left a note on the table. If I don't return, the truth is in John's journal. Then she mounted her horse and rode out dust, trailing behind her like a ghost refusing to be left behind. Hollow Creek lay 20 miles east, a place forgotten by time, carved into red earth and broken barns. She hadn't been there in years, didn't want to. Now she had to, and when she arrived, she found the barn, just like he'd described it, but older, collapsed on one side, and nailed to the doorframe was something chilling, a child's boot. Blackened by time, split at the toe, and beside it, another envelope. The boot wasn't just a symbol, it was a memory. Nailed in place, like someone wanted her to see it and feel it. Margaret dismounted slowly, eyes fixed on that tiny shoe. It was the kind of thing a mother never forgets, and though she'd never had children of her own. Her hands trembled like one who had just lost one. She reached out, fingers brushing the cracked leather. And behind it, tucked between two planks, was another envelope, dirt-smeared, torn at the corner. Inside, only 5 words, "You didn't hear me scream." Her knees nearly gave out, not from the letter, from what lay behind the door. The barn had half collapsed over time, beams rotting like infected bone, but part of the frame still stood, and behind it the earth was sunken in like something had been dug up or had tried to crawl out. She stepped inside, crunching over dry hay and glass. In the corner, a trapdoor, iron ring, rusted nearly shut. She tugged, it groaned, then gave way. Below, darkness. And stairs, wooden, narrow, leading to a basement no one ever mentioned. She lowered herself, lantern in hand, feeling the cold wrap around her like regret. The cellar was smaller than she expected. Just one room. Stone walls sweating with moisture. In the center, a rusted bed frame, chains still hanging from each corner. She felt something tighten in her chest. A child had been here. Kept here, there were carvings on the walls, scratch marks in stone. Dozens, maybe hundreds. One word etched deeper than the rest. Lure, and beside it a drawing. Face, rough, crooked, but unmistakable. It was John's. She backed away. Breath, sharp. This wasn't just about guilt anymore. This was about what he'd never told her, and what he'd never been able to forgive himself for. And yet, someone wanted her to see all this, to feel all this. Why? Her lantern flickered. She turned, and for the briefest moment, she saw someone at the top of the stairs, just a silhouette, still watching. "Who are you?" she called, voice unsteady. No reply, just footsteps. Walking away. Again, when she came back up, there was no one. Only the wind in the broken rafters, and the feeling that she'd passed through something sacred, or damned. But before she could leave, she saw fresh boot prints in the dirt outside, small, too small for a grown man. Someone wanted her to think he never grew up, and maybe he didn't. She looked at the setting sun. The sky bled orange and red dot tomorrow. She'd go back to Hollow Creek town itself. There were people there who remembered her husband, and maybe one of them remembered Eli. The town of Hollow Creek hadn't changed much. Dust still ruled its streets. The old saloon's shutters still hung crooked, and the church bell longed. Silenced, still sat rusting above the roofline like it was waiting for a reason to ring again. Margaret rode in just after noon. The sun was sharp, but her thoughts were sharper. She hadn't spoken to anyone here in years. Most folks barely remembered her. They remembered John, and now she needed their truths more than their politeness. She tied her horse near the trading post and walked straight into the general store. Behind the counter stood Mary Klein, a woman whose back was always straighter than her smile. Mary looked up, blinked, then blinked again. "Margaret Whitlow," she said softly. "Lord alive, I thought you'd vanished after John died." Margaret smiled faintly. I did, but now I need answers. Mary narrowed her eyes. You look like you've seen a ghost. I might have, Margaret said. Or maybe I'm just getting letters from one. That got Mary's attention. Within minutes, they were sitting at the back table of the store, a cup of tea between them. And Margaret unfolded one of the letters, the first one. Mary read it slowly, then again, and when she looked up, her face had drained of color. I know this handwriting, she whispered, but not from John, from someone else. Margaret leaned in, who Mary hesitated. Then, there was a boy once, Eli Harper, lived just beyond the ridge, came to town, sometimes with an older man, cruel eyes, rough hands. Folks thought he was the boy's uncle, but no one ever asked too many questions. John wrote about him, Margaret said. Said he left him behind, during something that happened right here. Mary went quiet. Then she whispered, that barn on the edge of town. The one near the broken windmill? Margaret nodded. They found blood there, years ago, and a chain. Sheriff said it was an animal, but no one believed that. Margaret's hands clenched. So what happened to the boy? Mary shook her head. No one knows. He just stopped coming. People assumed he ran. Or worse, but no grave, Margaret asked. Mary's eyes locked with hers. None we ever found. Margaret stood to leave, but Mary grabbed her hand. There's one more thing. The man who used to keep that boy, he's still alive. Doesn't talk much. Lives near Devil's Elbow Ridge. Margaret froze. Name. Mary's voice dropped. To a hush. Clayton Maris. And just like that, a name from the past crawled back into her life. John had mentioned him once. Only once. There are men, Maggie, who don't die when they should have. As Margaret stepped back outside, something glinted beneath her saddle. Another envelope, tucked where only someone who'd stood right beside her horse could have placed it. She tore it open. Heart racing. Only 2 words written in red. He remembers. Margaret didn't ride straight to Devil's Elbow Ridge. She needed time. Time to think. Time to breathe. The name Clayton Maris had hit her like a bullet dipped in old blood. John had whispered that name once. In his sleep in the 3rd year of their marriage, he'd muttered, Don't lock the door, Clayton. Please, he's just a boy. She thought it was a war memory. Now she wasn't so sure. She took the long trail east, skirting the edges of the canyons where the land buckled like old paper. Each hoofbeat echoed her heartbeat. The sun began to lower. By dusk the ridge came into view. A crooked rise of rock and pine, steep and jagged, untouched by time. There was a single cabin at the top, windows dark, chimney cold. But something about it felt awake. She dismounted, tied her horse quietly, crept forward. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. The door creaked open, a sliver, not from inside, but from the wind. She stepped in slowly. The air smelled like tobacco, rot, and something older. A table sat at the center, covered in old tin cans, empty bottles, and newspaper clippings, all yellowed. It's all about disappearances. And in the center of them, photo a boy no older than 10. Big eyes, torn shirt. And in the background, unmistakably, John Whitlow. She covered her mouth. This wasn't just memory. This was a record. Someone had kept track. Then she heard it a shuffle. From the back room, she turned slowly, hand hovering over her satchel where she kept John's journal. And then a man stepped out from the shadows, tall, gaunt, white beard tangled like roots. His eyes were cloudy, but not blind. Been expecting you, he said. Margaret stayed silent. You're John's woman. I knew you'd come once the boy started. Diggin' the boy? She asked. He grinned, and it split his face in 2. He never died, ma'am. Yeah. You think guilt keeps a man up at night? Try being the reason a child becomes something else? She felt her knees weaken. Who is he? She asked. What did John do to him? Clayton chuckled. It ain't what John did. It's what he didn't stop. The boy remembers the screams. Mine, John's, his. But he don't talk no more. Writes, You're reading it now, ain't you? Before she could answer, the window shattered. A rock had been thrown through it. Margaret rushed to look. No one. But the rock had something tied to it. Another letter. She untied it quickly. Inside, one line. He's lying. I never forgot your voice. She turned back. But Clayton Maris was gone. Not just gone from the room, gone from the cabin, like he'd never been there at all. The table. Empty. No clippings. No photo. Only one thing remained. A child's drawing. On the floor, a woman with yellow hair, a man with red hands, and a boy in a cage. Margaret stood frozen in that empty cabin. The child's drawing lay at her boots, simple, crude lines drawn with charcoal, but each one felt like a scream. A boy in a cage, a woman watching, a man with blood-colored hands. She knelt, picked it up. The paper was thick, torn from a journal. The edges were scorched, burned, like someone had tried to destroy it and change their mind. But what gripped her most was the handwriting scrawled at the bottom. You were singing. That's how I remembered you. Her breath hitched. She hadn't sung since before the war. But she used to, when John came home late, when the nights were quiet, and sometimes she sang at the window. The boy Eli had heard her. She stuffed the page in her satchel and stormed out of the cabin. The sun had dropped. As the wind turned sharp, she mounted her horse and rode hard. Not toward Hollow Creek, but away. She didn't know where, just knew she needed to get out. Of that ridge before her thoughts became too loud to silence, by the time she reached the riverbed, it was near dark. She set up a small fire and sat under a willow tree. John's journal open on her lap. One entry glared back at her. The boy was never supposed to see her, but he did, and he asked me, "Does she sing for you too?" I told him no, because she only sings when she's sad. Tears spilled silently down her cheek. She hadn't known how much John had noticed, and yet she wondered. Regret saving himself, or regret leaving Eli behind? Suddenly, something moved in the trees. Not loud, just real, heavy, deliberate. She rose, rifle in hand. Who's there? No answer. Then a whisper, barely audible, carried by the wind. K-A-A-H. A-H ... E. Spun, heart pounding. Eli. No reply, but the fire flickered, and when she looked back down, another letter had appeared beside her saddlebag. She hadn't seen it placed, hadn't heard it land, just like all the others. This one had more than words. It had ashes inside, and a torn piece of cloth, red flannel, like the shirt John used to wear. The note read, "The man who wore this sang too." But his songs were lies. Her stomach turned. Did Eli think John had sung to him? Lied to comfort him? Was this boy broken by lullabies? She leaned against the tree, unable to hold back the sobs. Not just for the boy, but for the man John had become. And the man he'd hidden, the pieces no one told her, the pieces she married. Without knowing, then came another sound, scraping from beneath the dirt. Just behind her fire pit, she turned slowly and saw something clawing up. It's boxed half-buried, old, rotted. She grabbed her lantern and brushed the earth away. Carved on the lid. M.W., her initials. She pried it open with shaking hands. Inside, A. Rusted harmonica, a bundle of dark hair tied in red ribbon, and a final letter. Sealed in wax, she didn't open it. Not yet, because the voice came again. It's time closer. Sharper. You sang while I screamed. The sealed letter sat in her lap, heavy in the way only truth could be. The wax was cracked along the edges. Someone had sealed it in a rush, but deliberately. The initials on the seal weren't John's. They were a child's shaky scrawl. E.H. Lee Harper. Margaret stared at the box again. The harmonica was familiar. John used to carry it in his vest, but she never saw him play it. Now she wondered if it had even been his to begin with, and the lock of hair. She touched it gently. It wasn't hers. Wasn't John's. It was a child's. still tied in red ribbon, still carrying the scent of ash. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she watched the shadows dance across the trees, waiting for the voice again. But it never came, just the wind. Just the fire's crackle, just the quiet. The kind that wrapped around grief like a second skin. At dawn, she opened the letter. You sang, but not for me. You sang for him, while I was beneath your feet, begging the dirt to carry. Sound. I didn't hate you then. I just wanted you to know I was real. But he told me to be quiet. He told me if I screamed loud enough, you'd stop singing. I screamed until my voice cracked. You didn't stop. Now I sing. When you sleep? Margaret dropped the paper. Her throat closed. Her hands trembled. She saw it now what the boy had felt. Invisible, forgotten, buried in silence. While joy echoed above, maybe she had sung that night. Maybe John had made her laugh. And maybe, beneath their floorboards or a barn or a shed, a boy had screamed. Into nothing. She packed the box and rode straight toward town. This time, she wasn't going to search for ghosts. She was going to face them. By midday, she arrived at the sheriff's office. But it wasn't the old sheriff she found. It was his. Sun-grown, tall, and worn like leather. He barely looked up. Ma'am, I need records, she said. About a boy. Missing boy. He raised an eyebrow. Plenty of those in this county. This one's name was Eli Harper. The name froze the air between them. He leaned forward slowly. That name's not in the books, he said carefully, because the man who took him was one of ours. Margaret blinked. The sheriff, he looked around, closed the office door. No, a deputy, long dead now. But he and Clayton Maris used to trade boys like cattle, promised discipline, promised to make men out of them. Margaret's voice cracked, and John. He nodded once, slow, pained. John found out, and he tried to report it. But the town buried it. Too many names, too much shame, so he left. But the boy never forgot, and some say he never left this land either. Margaret walked out dazed. It wasn't just guilt John carried. It was a crime the town tried to forget. A sin Margaret was never meant to uncover. But now it was here, alive, breathing and writing letters in her dead. Husband's hand that night back at her ranch, another letter was waiting. This time not folded, just laid across her pillow. Tomorrow, you go to the well. Bring no lies. The well stood at the edge of her ranch, old, cracked, covered with a plank she and John had nailed shut years ago. Never asked why he'd wanted it sealed. He'd simply said, nothing good ever came out of deep places. Letter's message was clear. Go to the well. Bring no lies. Margaret stood before it just after dawn. No birds, no wind. Even the grass refused to move. She pulled the plank loose. Dust burst from beneath, dry, sharp, aged. She leaned in. The well's mouth was a dark tunnel, too narrow to climb down. It's too deep to see bottom, but tied to the inside stone was a rope. Newer than the wood. Recently added, she pulled. Up came a small satchel. Leather, old, but not ruined. She untied it. With shaking hands, inside, a silver spoon engraved M.W. A child's drawing, a barn with two shadows and one light. And a final journal entry she didn't recognize. Not John's handwriting, but it was familiar. She read, they told me I'd become a man if I stopped crying. But men who bury their screams don't grow, they rot. She sang above me once, kept quiet because I thought her voice was a prayer. But prayers don't come with footsteps that walk away. Margaret sank to her knees. The spoon. It had gone missing when she first moved in with John. She'd thought she'd lost it in the move, but it had been buried here. Alongside the past, she looked around. Still no one. Then, sound breathing, not hers. From behind, she turned. A young man stood 10 feet away, thin, dusty, eyes wide. Unblinking, his coat too big, his face too young to carry such silence. She knew. She didn't need to ask. This was Eli Harper. But he didn't speak. He just held out a small harmonica, same as the one from the box, except this one had blood along the ridges. And when she hesitated, he said one sentence. He played this, while I forgot my own name. Margaret felt her legs shake. She didn't ask how he'd gotten it. Ask how he'd lived. Didn't ask why he hadn't spoken until now. Instead, she whispered, I didn't know, Eli. I swear to you, I didn't know. Didn't speak again. He simply handed her the harmonica, then pulled something from his pocket. A bullet, engraved with one word, justice. Then he turned and walked away. Margaret stood alone again, but something had shifted. She wasn't haunted. Anymore, she was summoned. Back in the house, she placed the harmonica on the mantel, set the bullet beside it, then opened John's journal one last time. There was one hidden pocket she'd never noticed. A flap at the back cover inside. A final message. If Eli returns, don't ask him for forgiveness. Give him the voice I stole. Margaret lit the fire, and for the first time in years, she sang. Her voice trembled at first, not from fear, but from memory. She hadn't sung since John's funeral. Even then, it had been a whisper, cracked, broken, borrowed from grief. But now, under the low timber roof of the house they'd built together, her song rose again. It's not for John, not for herself, but for the boy who had listened beneath the floorboards. Outside, the wind shifted. The ranch groaned. Old wood, old bones remembering inside. Margaret sang to the harmonica, to the spoon, to the bullet-engraved justice. It wasn't a lullaby. It was an offering that night. She left her front door open. A lantern hung from the porch. She waited, and at midnight, like always, a knock came. But this time, she answered it. Eli stood there again, this time closer, this time without the harmonica. He looked older now, not in face, but in presence, like something ancient was folded inside him. Margaret stepped back. He didn't enter. He just looked past her, toward the mantel where the relic sat. Then he asked, voice like dried leaves, did he scream when he died? Not Margaret's. Breath caught. What? Eli's eyes didn't blink. John, did he scream? Margaret shook her head slowly. No, he didn't die in pain. He died in his sleep. Eli looked down. I was hoping he'd screamed. The silence that followed felt eternal, but Margaret didn't run from it. She stepped forward, slow, steady, and reached into her satchel, pulled out the drawing Eli had made. The cage, shadows. The woman singing, I can't undo what? You lived, she whispered, but I can't stay silent anymore. Eli stared at the drawing. His fingers brushed the edges, trembling slightly. Then, he looked at her and said, he gave me one good day. Just one. Margaret's eyes watered. What did he do? Eli smiled faintly. Let me ride his horse, bareback, fast, across the valley. He closed his eyes. The wind almost made me forget. Then his hand dropped something into hers. Another letter. No envelope, just folded parchment. She unfolded it under the porch light. It was in John's handwriting. If she's reading this, it means I failed. Eli. And I failed her. I tried to bring light where I had no right to carry it. I took a boy and tried to pretend I could father away his scars. But wounds don't disappear just because you bandage them. If you stayed, ... if you survived. Tell her the truth. Tell her I didn't just leave you. I left the man I used to be, the one who didn't stop them when he could. Margaret folded the letter slowly. Eli watched her and said the last thing she expected. He gave me a name, said I should choose one. I never did. She nodded, through tears. You want me to name you now? He shrugged. No, I want to see if I remember it when this is all over. Then he turned, walked off into the night. No horses, no footsteps, just wind, inside the house. Margaret stared at the fire. She felt the weight of something leaving her chest. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. The next morning, Margaret found her front door ajar again. No letter this time, just a trail of ash, faint, leading toward the old barn. The barn hadn't been opened in years. John kept it locked tight, claiming the roof leaked and the floorboards were rotted through. But now it seemed pitted. Margaret followed the ash. In silence, each step felt like walking backward through time. She reached the barn's rusted hinges, pushed the doors open with a groan that sounded like a cry. Inside, dust, silence, and something else. A child's shoe, old, small, left near the far corner. She stepped closer and saw the earth had been disturbed, a grave unmarked, freshly dug. Her breath halted beside the shallow pit, folded coat, John's old riding coat, and resting on top of it. Photographed, it was cracked at the edges, faded with time. But clear enough, a younger John, a boy with dark eyes and a crooked smile. Margaret, barely visible, blurred in the background, this photo she'd never seen before, taped to the back in shaky pencil. The day he gave me my name. Tears blurred her vision. John had tried. Maybe not enough. Maybe too late. But he'd tried. She knelt beside the photo, buried her fingers in the loose soil, felt something solid beneath. She dug with her hands, gentle, trembling, pulled out a small tin box. Inside, a harmonica with a broken reed, a piece of paper with just one word written on it. Caleb. She whispered it like a prayer. Caleb. And somewhere, she swore, the barn exhaled. That night, she wrote her own letter. First time in months, not to John, but to Caleb. If you ever come back, know this. I remember now. I remember the silence I never questioned. Remember your name. I will never let this town bury it again. She placed the letter inside the tin, sealed it, and set it beside the barn door. Then she nailed a sign into the wood above it, Caleb Harper's barn. The townsfolk talked. They always did. But they didn't question Margaret anymore. Not after she walked into the general store with ashes on her dress and fire in her eyes. Not after she spoke. Eliza Nokaleb's name like it belonged there, because it did, and now it always would. The next evening, she returned to the porch, lantern lit, harmonica. On the mantel, letter sealed, and just before midnight, one final knock, she opened it slow. No, one stood there, just a shadow drifting down the hill, a boy no longer lost. The town of Dustwood Ridge had always been good at forgetting. It forgot its orphans, forgot its widows, forgot the names of the boys it failed, the men it protected, but not anymore. Not after Margaret nailed that name into wood. Caleb Harper's barn people whispered. They watched her with tight lips and wide eyes, because naming the forgotten was more dangerous than any gun. She walked through the market with Caleb's letter in her pocket. Eyes followed her. Some pitied her. Some feared her. And a few remembered. Like the old blacksmith, Tobias Gray. He looked at her as she passed, then said under his breath, "You should leave it buried." Margaret stopped. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Buried things rot. They don't heal. He flinched. Didn't speak again that evening. Sheriff Emmett, son of the former, rode to her ranch. She met him on the porch, arms folded. "Folks are nervous." He said, "You digging up ghosts?" They weren't ghosts when they screamed. He removed his hat, looked down. "My father, he knew about the boys, about Maris." Margaret didn't blink. "And I was just a kid," he whispered. "Why? Thought if I stayed quiet, it'd stay gone." She stepped closer. "Silence is how it was born, Sheriff, not how it dies." He handed her something then, an old badge. Rusty, blood-stained, Maris's, he said. Found it near the old mine 2 years after he vanished. Was John with him? The sheriff nodded once. Last one to see him alive. No one asked questions? Not ones they wanted answers to? She stared at the badge in her palm. It was heavier than it looked, like it still carried weight from the crimes it once guarded. She held it up to the sky. Then it's time the badge spoke. The sheriff looked spooked. "You going to tell the whole town?" Margaret didn't answer. She turned, walked inside, laid the badge beside Caleb's. Harmonica lit the fire and began to write. This time to the newspaper, not a letter in secret, but a statement. To whoever still holds power in Dustwood Ridge, there was a time when silence served men like Clayton Maris. The time is over. His badge is here. His name is Ash. But the boy he hurt, his name is Caleb Harper, and he lives. The truth, or I will. She sealed the envelope, marked it, to print. Immediately. Outside, thunder rolled. No rain yet, just the kind of sound that warned something old was waking. Margaret smiled bitterly. This town's built on bad weather. She struck a match, held it to Maris's badge one last time, didn't burn it, just reminded it, fire remembers, even when people forget. And from the hilltop, she saw him. A figure in the dark, watching the barn, hand on heart, just one nod. Then gone. By dawn, the letter was already printed. Dustwood's only paper had never seen a headline like this. The boy they buried, the woman who remembered. By Margaret Westwood, the paper sold out before noon. By evening, every saloon and saddle shop whispered the same name, Caleb Harper. Some folks cursed her for stirring up bones. Others left flowers by the barn door, but no one denied it anymore. Not after the sheriff confirmed the badge, not after a boy was seen standing at the town's edge, just watching. Margaret didn't hide. She walked into church that Sunday with her head high. The preacher paused when he saw her. She paused too. Then spoke. You baptize people, don't you, Reverend? He blinked. Oh. Yes, ma'am. Why? She held out Caleb's harmonica, then baptized a name. One this town left behind. He hesitated, then took the harmonica with both hands and said quietly, Bless the soul that still listens. That afternoon, Margaret visited John's grave. For the first time in months, she didn't bring flowers. She brought truth. I know. Now, she whispered, what you carried? What you couldn't say. She knelt, placed Caleb's old drawing at the base of the stone. I don't forgive you because you tried. I forgive you because you didn't let it end with silence. The wind picked up. Her eyes closed, and she heard it faint, but real. A harmonica, one note, broken, breathy, but peaceful. That night, box appeared on her porch. No knock, no footsteps. Just the box dot inside, the original spoon, Caleb's red ribbon. Carefully folded a new letter, short, clean ink. You gave me back my name, now I give you back your peace. We're even. She smiled through tears, lit the fireplace, and placed the letter in the mantel drawer, beside her wedding ring. At midnight, the knock came again, out of habit. She opened the door. No one stood there. But this time something had changed. The wind wasn't cold. The night didn't ache. In her chest, the hollow place where guilt had camped for months, felt quiet. She stepped outside, looked toward the hill. No figure, just stars, just silence, just peace. And when she turned to go back, inside, she left the door open. A week passed. No more letters, no harmonica, no footsteps, just stillness. But it wasn't hollow anymore. It was the kind of silence that follows truth like fog lifting after a long, endless war. Margaret spent her days mending fences, feeding the chickens, painting the porch, normal things, but everything had changed, because now every sound had meaning. Every wind gust whispered his name. Caleb. One evening, just before sundown, she lit a candle in the barn, set a new wooden box on the shelf inside. John's old photo, the rusted badge, Caleb's ribbon, and the spoon with her initials sleigh small note on top read, to be opened only when the town forgets again. Then she locked the box, sealed it in the floor. She wrote one last letter, not to John, not to Caleb, but to herself. You lived through fire, guilt, love, and shame. You spoke when it mattered. You remembered a boy the world tried to erase. That's enough. She folded it, placed it in the tin where the first letter had once come, and smiled. That night, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the sky turned burnt orange, She stood on the porch one last time. The lantern swayed gently. No, knock came. Because some doors never need closing. The camera would pull back here, if this were a film. Showing the ranch, the barn with Caleb's name, the hills that once held secrets, now holding stars, and one woman standing alone. Not lost. Not waiting. Whole. And if you've made it this far, let me tell you, the listeners, something too. There are stories like this in every town. Names that were buried. Boys who were never believed. Women who stayed quiet when they shouldn't have had to. If this story stirred something inside you, don't scroll away, like this video. Comment his name, Caleb.